Hi folks, I'm so glad you've been able to connect with the message today. My prayer for you is that you experience something of God and of God's heart for you. And as you listen to the sermon, I ask you to consider this one question. What is God stirring in you?
Esther chapter 4. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hatak, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hatak went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hatak came back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. And when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went and carried out all of Esther's instructions.
That on? Can you hear me? Yeah, there it is. Awesome. So, for anyone who missed it last week, we looked at chapter 1 of the book of Esther. We saw the lavish and opulent way that the king expressed his power and strength to the people, with no limit to his extravagance, and a 7-day banquet. We remember that nothing was off limits to the people, and he even commanded his servants to keep the food and the beverages flowing. You will remember that towards the end of this feast, after he had showed everyone a good time and denied them nothing, that he calls for his queen to come out, to leave the banquet that she was throwing for the women, put on her royal crown, her attire that displays her royal position, and come before the party. He considered her to be his most beautiful and precious possession, but she refused to come. And we dove into what that meant for her, the consequences of her disobedience. And we took a moment to put ourselves in that story and reflect on times that maybe we have not been obedient to our king. And while I personally believe that this is a very important story in this book, Vashti is not the focal point of the story. After all, it is not called the Book of Vashti. So today we will be diving into more of Esther's story. And as you heard from our reading today, we're starting at Esther chapter 4. And that's because I picked these verses really intentionally for the things that I want to say to you. But I will give you a summary of the 2 chapters in between so that you can kind of understand how we got there. But I would like to encourage you to go through and actually read the book of Esther in its entirety, because there is a lot of good richness there to be found. So Esther chapter 2 starts following the removal of Queen Vashti. King Xerxes has banished his queen and is seeking to find a new one. His servants suggest a nationwide search for beautiful young virgins to be brought to the palace, where they will undergo a year of beauty treatments. That feels a little excessive. It only took me 15 minutes to look this good. Thanks, Linda. Anyway, the woman who pleases the king will then be crowned queen in Vashti's place. And among those women chosen was Esther, a Jewish orphan raised by her cousin Mordecai, who is living in the Persian capital of Susa. And Esther is described as very beautiful, and she gains favor in the eyes of the palace eunuch, who gives her special treatment. Mordecai, who has been keeping an eye on Esther, regularly checks in on her at the palace. And during her time at the king's palace, Esther does not reveal her Jewish identity, as Mordecai had instructed her to keep it under wraps. After the year-long preparation, Esther is presented before King Xerxes, and he is immediately taken with her beauty and chooses her to be his queen, crowning her in place of Vashti. A great feast is held in her honor, and Esther is placed in the royal palace. Now, this is where it gets a little wild, and I did promise last week that this story had betrayal and assassination attempts, and so the end of this chapter is a brief account of Mordecai's involvement in a plot to assassinate the king. Mordecai overhears 2 of the king's eunuchs conspiring to kill him, and he informs Esther, who then tells the king, and the plot is crushed. Mordecai's loyalty is then recorded in the royal chronicles, though at this point that is not yet recognized. So what we see in chapter 2 is Esther's rise to prominence as queen, setting the stage for her key role in the events to come. It also introduces Mordecai's role as a protective figure for Esther, laying the foundation for his future involvement in this story. Chapter 3 then introduces our villain, Haman, who is promoted to position of high authority in the Persian Empire. King Xerxes elevates him to second highest position in the kingdom, making him the most powerful man under the king himself. And as a result, Haman is honored by all the royal officials and all the king's servants in the palace. They bow down to him, paying homage as a sign to respect and authority. However, Mordecai refuses to bow. He does not show him the honor that is expected, which greatly angers him. And when Haman realizes that Mordecai is a Jew and refuses to bow, he is enraged, not only at Mordecai, but at the entire Jewish people. Haman decides to take matters into his own hands and seeks permission from King Xerxes to issue a decree to annihilate all of the Jews in the empire. Haman casts lots to determine on which date the massacre of the Jews should take place. The lot falls on the 13th day of Adar, which is chosen as the day of destruction. Haman then approaches the king, telling him that a certain group of people, the Jews, have laws that are different from the Persian Empire, and that they do not obey the king's commands. He suggests that it would be in the king's best interests to destroy them. King Xerxes, unaware that Esther, his queen, his bride, is Jewish, and agrees to Haman's plan. He gives Haman his signet ring, allowing him to issue the decree to destroy the Jews. So a royal edict is sent out throughout the entire empire, declaring that on the 13th day of Adar, all Jews, young and old, women and children, are to be killed. The decree is sent out to every province, to the people, so the people are filled with confusion and terror at this news. And that brings us to our reading today. So this chapter starts off with Mordecai tearing his clothes, putting on sackcloth and ashes, and wailing bitterly. We see here Mordecai, who up until now has been portrayed as a very proud and capable man, putting himself in a vulnerable position where he is publicly grieving for his people. But not just publicly. The man marched to the palace gates, his place of employment, and made a scene. He probably did this to capture the attention of the queen, his beloved niece, and to draw her attention to what is happening outside the palace walls. He made a scene in front of his colleagues. He was not worried about saving face because the crisis on their hands was too great. This display is brought to Esther's attention, and you can imagine the look on her face when she hears this. She's probably shocked, concerned, maybe even a little embarrassed. Most of us have that slightly crazier than the rest family member, so I'm sure you can sympathize with how Esther is feeling in this moment. She's obviously concerned though, and so she sends her eunuch to go and see Mordecai and find out what he is doing and if he is okay. And when we then see in the reading that there is a lot of back and forth conversation between the eunuch and Mordecai and Esther. That can get, honestly, a little bit confusing. And while I personally loathe a phone call, I would think that this would be the right moment to have that, or a face-to-face conversation. But practicality aside, here in these interactions, you see lots of emotion and real heaviness of spirit. There is desperation and pleading for understanding. There is probably frustration for Mordecai that this young woman who once lived in his home, he can now no longer have a simple conversation with. She was unreachable to him due to her new position. He is expressing to her a deep urgency and weight of their predicament, and hoping that the eunuch is then portraying that accurately. He's relying on someone else to get the message to her. And so Mordecai is calling Esther to intervene for their people. He wants her to approach the king and advocate for the Jews. He gave her detailed intel on all the horrific things Haman had planned, and all the schemes and the bribery were explained to her. He wanted to make sure that she had a clear understanding of why they needed intervention, why she needed to plead for mercy on behalf of the people. I imagine this may have been quite shocking to her. We do not know what kind of relationship she had with Haman. He is, after all, second to the king, so maybe this did come as a shock to her, that he would even ask the king to do something like this. Maybe she thought he was someone of good character. If you've watched One Night with the King, you might think that she could always tell that he was a little bit creepy and a little bit off. But putting Haman aside, put yourself in Esther's shoes when she finds out that the king, her husband, her bridegroom, has approved the annihilation of an entire people, her people, men, women, and children. And I wonder how she would have felt in that exact moment. Verses 10 and 11 say, "Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, 'All the king's officials and the people of the royal province know that if any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go before the king.'" She is trying to explain the severity of what he is asking of her. Mordecai would already know this. This is not going to be shocking information to him. But the point of her relaying this is that he can understand and she can clarify what exactly he is asking of her. They are asking her to put her life on the line. They are asking her to sacrifice herself. It's in this moment that you realize just how powerful being in the king's presence actually is. He calls you like Vashti and you refuse to come, exile. He doesn't call you and you go anyway, possible death. You wouldn't be remiss in thinking that this could be the end of the conversation, that the eunuch would take her response to Mordecai. He would respond something eloquent like, "You're right, that's crazy. My bad. I was just thinking out loud." But alas, that is not what we see here. Instead, we see him dig deep. We see him essentially call her out. Verse 12 says, "When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back his answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, that you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish, and who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." When we read these verses, it's easy to pull out the line "for such a time as this." I find every good story has a one-liner that people remember. Luke, I am your father. Star Wars. Or what about, I'll be back. Arnie, Terminator. This is a classic. You're gonna need a bigger boat. Jaws. You can see what I'm doing here. Great stories come with great one-liners, and Esther is no different. And while we will get to that, I want to draw your attention to another great line. If you remain silent, relief and deliverance will arise from another place. This struck me because there is an invitation here. There is an opportunity here. While the name of God is not specifically mentioned here, Mordecai is saying to Esther, if you ignore this and you say nothing, God will rise up another, but you will miss out. This passage is humbling. He is also saying to her, I'm not sure if your crown has made you forget, but you too are a Jew. You will not be saved from this. Men, women, and children are all at risk. Up until this moment, there is a good chance that Esther had only been considering the consequences of approaching the king and not fully grasped the consequences of not approaching the king. Realistically, it could be death either way for her. He is reminding her that she is given an opportunity. And this struck me because it is both honouring and humbling in tandem. We see here Esther being invited to be part of a bigger picture on one hand. While scary and dangerous, it is an honour to be invited, to intercede and to stand in the gap for her people. But on the other hand, it is humbling because God doesn't need her in order to provide deliverance for his people. He can do it without her, but he is inviting her into it. And who knows? Maybe she has come to her royal position for such a time as this. Take a moment to think. Have you ever found yourself in a position and thought, how did I get here? Why me? Have you ever found yourself in the right position at the right time? The statement "for such a time as this" encapsulates the theological themes of divine providence and human responsibility. While divine providence underscores God's sovereignty, Scripture also emphasises the importance of human effort and responsibility. The Bible teaches that humans are called to work diligently and make wise choices aligning with God's will. For such a time as this is God's divine plan being implemented and you courageously stepping out in faith into it. Last week, I asked you, When have you heard a call from God and ignored it? When have you felt like Vashti? This week, I want to ask you, when have you heard an invitation from God and courageously answered it? When have you felt like Esther? That you were standing exactly where you were meant to be for a specific purpose and you leant in. You were aligning yourself and abiding with God. When were you aware of your royal position as sons and daughters of the King and invited to claim it? Verse 15 says, Then Esther sent the reply to Mordecai, Go gather all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. We can see that Esther did this, but she didn't just take Mordecai's word for it and run. She turned to the one who can give the answers, the one who can show the way. And she called for the Jews, for her community, to fast and to pray with her. We have looked at the decadence and display of power that food and drink has in this society. But here again, we see the contrast between Vashti and Esther. While Vashti sat at a banquet surrounded by an abundance of food and drink, saying, No, I will not go. Esther denies herself food and drink and says, Yes, I will go. Vashti does not put on her crown, her symbol of belonging to the connection of the king, and refuses to go before him. Esther puts on her royal robes, a display of her position and status within the kingdom, and courageously does go before the king. What I love about this story the most is not her royalty and her position of power. It's her humility. But her humility did not make her weak. When we think of a triumphant story where an entire group of people are saved from annihilation, spoiler alert, that's what we'll get to next week, we often think of superheroes. Superman, Wonder Woman, Iron Man, all of these people you would look at and think, yep, you could save us. But Esther is an orphan girl. She's also a girl in times when that immediately lowered her status. She is no warrior or soldier, but there is strength in her character, her humility, her femininity, her culture and spiritual identity all come together in this perfect storm that put her in a position for such a time as this. You, as you are now, is who God is inviting to be courageous. Not the you who is working out more or reading your Bible more. He just wants you to say yes. The courage to state, if I perish, is the exact position God invites us to. We are being invited as individuals and as the church to be bold and courageous, to step out even though it's scary and it could cost us. But doing nothing will also cost us. You know that whenever I speak, I love to recommend a song. So today is no different. There is a song by Lauren Daigle called Then I Will. So before we close in prayer, I invite you to close your eyes if you feel comfortable. I want you to hold the story of Esther in one hand, and I want you to hold your story in the other as you listen to these lyrics that I'm about to read to you. They go, I'll surrender everything. All for you I will. abandon every part of me. All for you I will. No matter what the cost may be, if it's for me to die for love, if it's for me to die for love, then I will. Let's pray.